Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
We are back for another episode of The Curious Collector. I'm Stuart Holbrook. So happy to be here again with you today on a whole different subject. We had so much fun with 3 parts with Florence Theriault. If you haven't heard them, go back and listen to it about her 55 years in the auction and doll world. And just a really personal, touching memorances from her over the years. Again, if you haven't heard, please get on back there and listen to those previous episodes. Today, as I always do, update you from where I am in the country. I am coming to you from Salt Lake City, and where I just did a lecture for one of the doll clubs on my Table Talk Tour of America, speaking to doll clubs about collecting, great tips for collecting, the future of collecting, and just having a general conversation. Fabulous group, and love to hear some of the stories they tell me as well. There was a woman in the club who was actually in a really kind of teary moment. I have to admit, I had something in my eye as well when she was telling the story of growing up in Germany during the war as a young girl. And she was talking about a doll that she had that was named Frida. And this doll, it was her solace. It was the thing that was the constant for her. And she managed to survive, and the doll survived as well during the war. And afterwards, it ended up, I shouldn't laugh, but it's the irony of life, I guess I'm laughing at. The doll ended up being broken by her cousin. And she spent years so sad and missing Frida, and spent years searching for this same identical doll. And in the process, and this is kind of the fun, wonderful story behind how we start collecting, which I've got to do a podcast on this at some point, how and why we start to collect. But she began discovering other dolls in the process. And during her search for Frida, she began collecting other German Bis dolls, eventually amassing around 300 of them, until one day she found that exact doll that was Frida and became a collector. So kind of a fun story, and I don't think there was a dry eye in the room as she was telling it. It's not always just me talking. I love to listen to the collectors as well in these get-togethers, and it was a fun time. Thank you to the Louis Sorensen Doll Club. A shout out to you for a fabulous day. And now it's moving on to Reno and Seattle, where I've got a lineup of more Doll Club table talks. So on my way there, ladies and gents. So here today, we're going to talk about something that is actually a part of what I talk about in these table talk gatherings, and that is the future of collecting and the new generation that will be coming into collecting. And I talk about this based upon what I know is the ultimate fear of every collector. And I have heard this through multiple generations. They always start off by saying, Stuart, it seems like everybody's older that collects. And I'm like, well, yes, that's standard in every generation. People don't collect generally in their 20s, 30s, 40s even. There are exceptions, obviously. Our producer, Tammy Trujillo here, started in her teen years. So that, of course, is an anomaly, though, in that the reality is most people come into their collecting age really in their 50s and 60s and ramp it up and go full on in their 70s. And why is that? It should be for obvious reasons that you probably already know. The kids are gone. Your house is settled. You're not moving. Your job is secure, or you're retired. You know what money you have to spend, and you have more time. So all of these factors really relay into the golden age period of collecting being your 50s through your 80s. And this is what we see through every generation. But of course, every generation says, but there's no one young collecting. Who will take over my dolls? Who will they go to? And this is a legitimate fear of collectors, because I always say that collecting anything, it could be dolls and it could be baseball cards, whatever, it is an extension of yourself. It is an extension of your being. It is part of your identity in a lot of cases. And people who I've talked to who collect agree with this, that in some ways it's almost a form of self-preservation. So it would make a lot of sense that if this is the case, of course your greatest fear would be, after I'm gone, where will my dolls go? Because this self-preservation includes the idea that while we're gone, these items live on through multiple generations. And I like to say they carry a bit of energy of us. And in that, you will have this natural tendency to be concerned that when you go and your dolls are up for the movement to the next generation, there will be nobody there to take them. And that is simply not the case. There is always a new generation coming into collecting. They are different. Every generation is unique in the way they engage, what they collect, how much they want. We've talked about the great generation of accumulators back in the 70s and 80s and what triggered their collecting patterns, which tended to be towards massive accumulations of thousands of dolls. And then we talk about a more pragmatic generation today of minimalists, call it, who don't want $2,000. They want 150 to 200 really high quality top end pieces. So every generation comes with its own set of, I don't want to call them rules because there's no rules in collecting, but let's just call it their own set of values as to collecting based upon their youth, their growing up, their society today, a lot of different factors. So we look at the future generation, if we want to analyze, I mean, obviously, I love talking about the great accumulators because they were an interesting study for, let's call it the triggers of collecting. What triggers the idea of collecting to begin with? For a lot of them, if you talk to them, they trace their collecting really to their growing up during the Depression era, in which they had nothing. And they were basically without dolls, without things. And this need later on in life to collect and protect items was a sort of revenge towards growing up in that atmosphere and environment. It's kind of like after COVID, everybody started traveling and you heard the term revenge travel coming up and you couldn't get a hotel room anywhere in the world. Everything was way overpriced. Flights were booked up because everybody was revenge traveling. And so I think the great accumulators was revenge collecting to their youth. It was the trigger. So if you look at each generation, analyze their youth, the society they grew up in, you can see some of the trends that we're going to have for the future. I love being a bit of a futurist to analyze collecting and how it is going to develop. And I predicted a number of things over the years, and it was based on data, and sometimes it's based on just intuition and experience that I have in working with so many collectors around the world to kind of see the trends that are happening from year to year. One of the areas I talk about a lot now is this next generation coming into the classic collecting age. Who are they? Millennials. Yes. And you're probably all thinking millennials as collectors. I don't know. Is that really a thing for them? Here it is. Mark this down right now. Say that you heard Stuart tell this to you in 2025, but millennials will be the singular greatest collecting generation the world has ever seen. There it is. You heard it from me. Now, I'm clearly going to back this up with data, with insight, with conversations I've had with millennials and things that I've seen along the road in my travels. I start off, first of all, with when I began to see this trend and moving towards millennials having a passion for what they like to call old-timey, that is tactile, old objects that are recycled from years ago, things that are tangible, real, touchable, things that have age and have stories. They love this stuff. And you can see it if you travel to places like Portland, Oregon, or Austin, Texas, or go to Brooklyn in New York and walk around the neighborhoods and look at everybody doing old-timey type businesses. You've got hipster guys with tattoos and long hair opening up old school butcher shops and decorating them in old school style, even utilizing old antique tools. You have old school barber shops with antique barber chairs, and inside is a 28-year-old guy who's total hipster and loving this old time, old way of doing things. You have old speakeasies being opened up all over the country in these cities, appealing to this millennial generation that are really, really into what I term, well, I didn't term it actually, but what I use, the term secondhand nostalgia. This was actually coined by the great futurist Faith Popcorn. And I know you're probably thinking, what is that name? But that is her actual name. Now, Faith Popcorn is one of the most revered and read futurists in the world today. Give you a little background. Coca-Cola hired her in the 70s to come up with the next great beverage for them, and she told them bottled water. And I think I've mentioned this in my podcast before, so if I'm repeating this, I apologize, but it's a great story. She told them bottled water, and they didn't listen. She told Kodak years before digital was a thing that they've got to go all in on digital. They didn't listen. She's predicted everything over the years through society, through the last 50 years and forward. She's now in her 80s. And in the early 2000s, she wrote about society in 2050 and what it would look like. And she predicted that millennials actually would be great nostalgic collectors and what she termed secondhand nostalgia. She also predicted a lot of the trends that we're seeing now in the movement towards working from home, being at home more, kind of living your life home-based, being able to exist primarily from home. She called it cocooning, which was the term she came up with that we all use now. So a really interesting character in that she actually saw that millennials would become very fascinated by what she termed secondhand nostalgia, and we just know as basically nostalgia for the past, for different things. Well, why millennials? What about their life would really create this? I would say it's many factors. You have all of the massive changes over the past 30 years. I mean, the oldest millennial right now, I believe, is 44, if my number is right. So imagine everything they grew up with. They grew up with the rise of the internet age. They grew up with the rise of the smartphone. They grew up with disasters like 9/11, the Great Recession, all of these things, broken homes, a family and parents that generally were the minimalists, that believed in disposable, wanted to move houses 10 times, loved to go shop at IKEA, and every 4 years change everything. This was how they grew up. And so they never really had stability of beautiful objects surrounding them, things that were made for generations, things that were built to last, things that were built with pride and love and dedication. And in this process, they became nostalgic for something that they never had. Collecting a lot of times is a replacement of something you never had, just as the great generation of accumulators collected out of the Depression era, having nothing. So this is the first thing I will say in analyzing this, is remembering that the generation or the times that millennials came out of this is really impacting their love of the tactile and the love of old objects. But interestingly enough, let's take a step back and understand that there has to be still a reason or desire to collect. So why do we collect? We know these reasons we just talked about, but there has to be some propensity or understanding of the collecting process to really get this trigger motivated and moving forward. And we are seeing it with millennials for a reason that a lot of you have absolutely no idea, because you don't do it yourself. And that is, get ready for this one too, video games. What? Video games? Yes, I say. Why would video games be a trigger towards a understanding of collecting? Well, it's quite simple. If you are a gamer, and millennials are the greatest generation of gamers out there. They have grown up with it since they were 7, 8, 9 years old, playing video games, peer-to-peer, online, with communities all over the world. Well, you probably don't understand or realize that within video games, the culture of collecting is very, very real. They collect armaments, they collect cars, they collect clothing, they collect homes. They have little goods and tokens and trophies, and anything you could imagine is collectible within the video games. There is probably, no one knows for sure, but it's believed that there are multiple billions of dollars in collectible trading going on within video games. As a matter of fact, in some countries in Europe and Asia, the governments there have actually banned certain parts of collectible trading, which would be more speculative in nature, because it is truly addicting some of these young kids. Now, we all know there's a certain level of addiction in collecting, and I think it's a positive one, obviously, because you're getting something tangible, you're getting, hopefully in the end, return, and you're getting joy from the object. So it's not like it's a bad addiction. It's a good addiction, but what's happening is these governments have been looking at a lot of these kids that are 8, 9, 10 years old, and they are absolutely into the collecting zone. So you have millennials who grew up with these video games, still playing them today, still collecting within there, and fully understanding the joy of dopamine release when you collect something and you get something rare or something you've wanted for years and you're able to achieve it. That dopamine is powerful stuff, and it's getting triggered in them from like 7, 8, 9 years old. No generation of collectors ever got started with the idea of collecting so young. So they're starting in these video games and they're moving on from there with a pure understanding of the joys of collecting. So what are they collecting outside of video games? Will they collect outside of video games? Absolutely. I don't know if you all watch some of the, I don't know, call it pop culture, I guess. I mean, pop culture is a very broad term, but some of these markets that are going on right now that I believe are purely millennial driven, with a lot of money out there, that millennials are now in their 40s, some of them, and they are a lot of the tech industry bros and sisters that are making decent money, really good money early on in the technology world. And they are absolutely impacting some of these markets. As an example, just recently at auction, I believe a year or two ago, a fully wrapped, never opened Back to the Future VHS. Yes, a VHS. Remember those? But an original VHS of Back to the Future, unopened, sold for $78,000 for a VHS tape. There was a Star Wars action figure. I forget which character it is. I'm not a Star Wars kind of guy, but it was one that was only a few were ever produced, I believe by Kenner, but I'm not positive, and never really put into distribution. And so very few are known to exist in the world today. It sold at auction, get ready, $750,000. You thought dolls were expensive? How about action figures from Star Wars? So I look today at, from the doll perspective, looking at areas like Barbie, BJD, Monster High, Bratz, all of these types of dolls culturally that are digging into the nostalgic youth of millennials. And you're seeing those markets starting to really take off. You're seeing these markets absolutely having interaction by millennials. I mean, I'm not going to lie. Very few millennials are buying Brews or Hurrays or anything along those lines, but they will. Every generation has their gateway. That gateway is nostalgia. That nostalgia is the entry point. Some will stop there. Some will never go beyond that, but many of them will. I know countless collectors over the years who started with Barbie or started with Madame Alexander or Ginny or American Composition, and that led to the next thing. I always call these nostalgia dolls the gateway drugs. This is what brings you into the big stuff. Not everybody goes there, but a lot of them do. And it can be quite exciting when it happens because millennials will be a very empowered, rich generation. We are going to have one of the biggest transfers of wealth in history from baby boomers. And these people are going to be millennials, primed and ready. And in some cases, it's going to even extend to, I would say, the older members of Gen Z who share a lot of similar upbringing and played video games and got into the collecting world, much like millennials have. And I mentioned Barbie earlier, so let me go back on that a little bit and analyze that because that's a known, I don't want to call it commodity, but a known subject within our field that a lot of us can relate to. The Barbie movie came out and a lot of people said, oh, the Barbie market is really taking off because of the Barbie movie. And I would say no. I would say the Barbie movie was a product of an already growing nostalgic frenzy towards Barbie that had been evolving through millennials in many cases. And Hollywood producers and studios saw the opportunity for this movie to reach out to the greatest generation of moviegoers there is, and that is that age group of millennials, and realized there is opportunity there. Because there is a recognizable love of nostalgia of that period. And you can even look at it with what people collect in Barbie now and watching it kind of move more and more towards this current millennial youth generation. I remember years ago when mod period Barbies were never a thing. Nobody really wanted them. And then that generation who had them as youth became collectors and they started taking off. Now you're seeing that superstar era of Barbie really starting to take off and develop, call it the 70s, 80s period. And that's going to continue on where you will see a lot of the 80s and 90s period already happening where people are getting into that because it was their nostalgic youth. And this will be millennials. Interestingly enough, too, we analyze the gender aspect of collecting, that is women versus men. And we know that men dominate many of the other fields like comic books and baseball cards and collectible cars and that type of thing. And you will see massive, massive world record prices in those particular categories. Dolls have always sort of languished in the corner of collecting and never had these monster world record prices like you see $10 million for a baseball card as one random example. We see $335,000 for what is probably one of the most incredible creations ever made in the world of figurative art, and that's the Rochard doll. And that is because women dominate our particular field. And for many years, if I go back to the great accumulators of the 1970s and 80s, you had a generation of women collectors who, I'm going to say it because I know it, and you're all going to shake your head and you're going to say, I know he's right. It was the grocery money skimming generation of collectors. And I sat at a home years ago in Whittier, California. His name was Houston Knight, and his wife had passed away. They had been married for 55 years, and they were old school generation. And he said, Stuart, I haven't gone grocery shopping in 50 years. And now my wife passed away. I've had to go, and I can't believe how milk has come down from $20 a gallon. So it was all skimming the grocery money to buy dolls. And she managed to get about $1 million collection in the end, all through that. We've already seen this has changed dramatically. In the generation, even now, you have far more empowerment financially with women who are collectors. And when we get to millennials into their classic collecting age of their 50s and 60s as the beginning and their 70s as the prime period, look out. This group of women is far more empowered, and they have their own bank accounts. They've had careers. Many of them have businesses. They don't look to their husbands for permission or for financial help in their collection or their particular passion. And they will drive this market far more than we've probably ever seen. So imagine that. A generation of the most empowered and financially wealthy women ever to come into the classic collecting age. And they are millennials. They grew up with this. They've had the triggers of dopamine over the years through video games and other things. They love and have a passion for the tactile, for the old objects. And it will be a moment. I believe. So I can tell you, for the collectors worried, where will my dolls go? They will go to millennials, and they will love them. And they will be one of the greatest collecting generations in history. So how will they collect, though? Because it's going to be very, very different, I think, in the approach of their engagement, that is, where they go, their marketplaces, what they collect, how much they collect. I believe that there will be a lot of similarities to this current generation of collectors, and that there's going to be more of a pragmatic approach. They're not going to want thousands of things. And, people are living in smaller homes now. It's just not possible. So I expect them to be similar again to this current generation in looking to have balanced collections of 100, 200, 300 objects, maybe maximum, trying to go to the top end of their particular category of things that they love and collect, not buying up duplicates. You're not going to see mass accumulating collections like we saw in the 80s and 90s. I also see a whole new trend that is already emerging, and I think a lot of it will really be fueled by millennials in the future, and that is the concept of fractional ownership, which is really a fascinating subject, and I'm going to do a whole separate podcast on it, so I'm not going to go into a lot of the details, but give you a little background. Fractional ownership, and you can go to a couple websites to get a feel for it. One of the companies is called Rally. Rally, and you can go to their website, rallyrd.com, and take a look. They are buying up rare collectibles. I'm looking at it right now, as a matter of fact, and we can look at, they have a 1940 DC Comics Batman #1. They've got an Elvis Presley Last Live Performance ticket. They've got a 1965 Ford Mustang Fastback. So they buy these objects. They then actually file SEC documents to make them an opportunity for investors to buy shares of that piece. Each item becomes like a company. And so you buy a share of this item, but you don't actually ever hold it or touch it. You can see it. You can go to the showroom they have in New York City, and you can look at some of the pieces, but you are just a shareholder in expensive, rare collectibles and artwork. The example, let's look at the 1965 Ford Mustang Fastback. Maybe a car you've dreamed and loved over the years, but you could never afford their market cap of $83,000 in value, which for a lot of people might be impossible. However, you can buy a share in that Ford Mustang Fastback at $41.25. And you will then have a certificate and say, I own shares in this fabulous Ford Mustang. You'll never drive it, but you own a share in it. Now, the current generation, I know a lot of you, I was talking to my producer, Tammy, about this off the air, and I just can't believe it. Why would you ever want to just own a share of something that you can't even touch or, in this case, drive? That just seems crazy. And I get it. But millennials like this because, remember, let's go back to how they are emerging as collectors out of video games. It's virtual. None of it's real. Yet there are billions of dollars being traded in this regard on virtual items. So this is no different. Actually, this is even a step up. These are real objects, but they just don't actually physically own it. So you're going to begin to see this really develop, especially as millennials come into the investing, collecting age, 50s, 60s, 70s, of this fractional ownership, I believe, developing. Now, we haven't seen dolls show up yet on any of these sites. I wonder if one day you'll be able to buy for $10 a share of an Albert Mark Bebe with a market cap of $130,000. And then you'll be able to say, I own shares in an Albert Mark. It's very possible and probable that we are going to be seeing this in the future, even in our world of dolls. They've been doing it in the art world now since about 2015. There's another company and website you can go to called Masterworks. I mean, I'm talking $10 million paintings with huge market caps where you can buy shares in this. And I'll talk more detail in a future podcast on fractional ownership collecting and how millennials will be part of that generation to really drive this market. There's also going to be a lot of differences in the collecting environment across the world with millennials. They are going to be far less, I would say, social in the idea of their collecting and their hobby than we are today. I mean, a lot of collectors today, they look at dolls as, okay, they love the stories, they love the tangible, they love the beauty, they love the collecting part of it, but a lot of it too is very social for them. They make friendships out of this. They make bonds. They meet like-minded people that they can enjoy this hobby with and these adventures and traveling around the world together in the hunt for dolls. And I get it. That's a really great thing, but I think you're going to see a bit less of that from millennials. As an example, I mean, you're seeing doll clubs now getting smaller and smaller. Some of them actually closing shop even in large metropolitan areas. I mean, here in Salt Lake City, I spoke at the club yesterday. They're now the only doll club in the entire region of Salt Lake City. This is a booming metropolis. Millennials are just not going to be, I think, doll club goers. Now, will they engage in communities of collectors? Yes, but they will primarily do it online. They will build up a small group or small little community of their own of people that they enjoyed meeting on the internet probably, and they will share, exchange stories, maybe even meet occasionally, but it will all be based on the internet. And that is going to be the future, I think, of the socializing aspect of collecting, and it will be driven a lot by millennials' tendencies in this particular. And we can even see it in this current generation that there's less and less engagement in person at even large-scale major auctions. We see conventions being less. And I think, talking about conventions, that to appeal to millennials, I believe millennials like big events, but they have got to be wild, big events. For doll collecting, I think conventions need to be more like Coachella. They need to be wild, multifaceted. There needs to be a Madame Alexander convention, a Barbie convention, the Antique Doll convention, a BJD convention, Ginny convention. I mean, every category you can imagine. They should all be doing it at the same time. There should be auctions and parties and festivals all in the city on the same week, like Comic-Con does in San Diego, or the Pebble Beach Collectors Car Rally that's held every year, where there's car events going on that everybody just goes from one big party or event to another. This is what I think millennials will look for in a convention event, and how the future needs to be shaped really to meet the needs of this generation, or they just won't come. So these are a lot of interesting side angles just beyond the collecting aspect, but also the socializing and the engagement in collecting from millennials that we will have to pay attention to this generation in order to assure a transfer of this history and these items to what will be a fabulous moment in collecting, but vastly different than we're seeing today, for sure. So look out for the millennials and even the Gen Z collectors of the future. They're coming. In about 10 years, they're going to be entering that golden age of collecting, and they are going to be coming in with passion and frenzy and love of these old objects, maybe like we've never seen before. They're going to be on TikTok showing their dolls. We're going to be on Facebook, maybe still talking about them here, but they're going to be bringing in as well a whole new platform and a whole new way to communicate what is ultimately the same passion we all share. The love of old objects, the stories that they have to tell, and the tangible, tactile beauty of an antique doll.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media, and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault, or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.